We're diving into something today that I think a lot of us have felt, even if we haven't quite had the language to describe it. It's about the shifting ground beneath us. Specifically, the shifting ground of American faith and how it intersects with our politics.
Yeah, that intersection is everything.
Right. We have a massive stack of notes here. I mean, ranging from sociology to history to psychology. But honestly, this all starts with a personal observation.
Those are usually the most powerful.
So, I was sitting in a quiet church lobby a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a woman who had spent 40 years in the pews.
Wow, 40 years.
Yeah, a lifetime. And she was the kind of person you'd instinctively want as a neighbor. Warm, soft-spoken, and she kept this small, well-worn New Testament in her purse.
I can picture her.
Right. She spent 20 minutes telling me about the radical love of Christ and how her faith was the bedrock of her life. She seemed genuinely moved, her eyes even misting over when she spoke about the importance of welcoming the weary. The core of the gospel message, really. Exactly. Someone nearby mentioned a news segment about a local shelter for undocumented families.
Oh.
The warmth just vanished. Her posture stiffened, and that same voice that had been praising mercy moments ago, it started talking about protecting our own and the need for a hard line.
And did she back it up with scripture?
Not a single verse. Instead, she pulled up a viral clip on her phone, a grainy, high-contrast video of a border crossing with this fearful caption about an invasion.
Right.
To her, that 15-second clip carried more weight than the Sermon on the Mount she'd been studying for decades. It was a jarring, instantaneous shift from the language of the Good Samaritan to the logic of a judge and jury. And as I watched her, I realized she wasn't an outlier. She is the face of a massive seismic shift that sociologists and theologians are now calling a Faustian bargain.
A deal with the devil.
We are witnessing a movement that claims the name of a man who welcomed the outcast, yet is increasingly defined by who it excludes and who it judges.
Yeah.
It is a crisis of credibility that isn't just emptying pews, it's fundamentally rewriting the identity of American Christianity.
Right.
So the big question is, why has the gospel of love become, for so many, a weapon of political judgment? And what happens to a faith when its loudest followers no longer resemble its founder?
It's a haunting image, isn't it? That physical transformation you described, from warmth to steel in a split second. I think it's important we sit with that for a moment because it encapsulates the entire mission of this deep dive.
Correct.
We aren't just here to talk about voting patterns or, point fingers at hypocrisy. Frankly,
It lets us off the hook too easily.
because what you witnessed in that lobby is the symptom of a profound structural and psychological reorganization of American life.
Right, because if we just look at it as she changed her mind, we miss the scale of it. It felt deeper than an opinion. It felt like an identity switch.
Exactly. We are looking at theology, yes, but not in a vacuum. We're looking at how an institution that was historically designed for social stabilization, I mean, literally created to hold communities together through affection and mutual aid, has transformed into a primary engine of political polarization.
It's a huge reversal.
A total reversal. It's a story about demographics, it's a story about fear, and it's a story about leadership. But mostly, it's a story about how we define us and them and what we are willing to trade to keep those definitions secure.
And to really understand that trade, that Faustian bargain, we have to look at the community itself. What happened to the place of the church? Because it seems like the very atmosphere has changed.
It's the first thing you feel when you walk in the door.
I was reading through some forum threads recently, and I came across the story of a young woman named Sarah from a small town in Ohio. For years, her local church was the town's social stabilizer. That was her term. It was the place where people brought casseroles to grieving neighbors and, fixed each other's roofs.
That's glue.
The absolute glue. But Sarah describes a jarring shift that happened over the last decade. She watched as the Sunday school lessons on loving thy neighbor were gradually replaced by urgent calls to reclaim the culture.
The language changed.
Completely. The sanctuary, which once smelled of old hymnals and coffee, began to feel like a campaign headquarters.
I have heard that exact phrase from so many people. Yeah.
Sarah eventually left, joining the growing number of nuns cited in Pew Research data.
Of course.
And she told her story not with anger, but with a profound sense of social anomie, a feeling of being adrift, because the one institution that was supposed to provide a sense of belonging had traded its communal warmth for a polarized political identity.
Normlessness.
Yeah. And as I reflect on Sarah's experience from my perspective as a journalist, it's just It's heartbreaking to see how the search for political power can inadvertently dismantle the very community it claims to protect.
It eats its own.
And while I understand the fear of losing traditional values in a rapidly changing world, watching a young person lose their spiritual home because it became a political battlefield suggests that the cost of this identity might be the soul of the community itself.
That phrase Sarah used, social stabilizer, is historically incredibly significant. It's not just nostalgia.
It's a technical term almost.
Yes. If we look back at the 19th century, at what historians call the Evangelical Empire, the church functioned as an affectional community.
It's affectional community.
Well, think about the context of the 1800s. America was expanding, people were moving west, leaving their extended families behind.
Right, total upheaval.
Total upheaval. It was a chaotic, mobile, and often ruthless race of life. There was no social safety net. If you got sick, if your barn burned down, you were on your own.
There was no FEMA, no Social Security.
Nothing. The church stepped into that void. It was an organizational revolution. It wasn't just about believing the same things. It was about mutual obligation.
So it was functional. It wasn't just, we go here on Sundays. It was, this is how we survive.
It was survival. If two members had a dispute, say, over a property line or a debt, they didn't go to the civil courts.
Really?
Yes. Going to court was seen as a failure of brotherhood. It was a public airing of dirty laundry that undermined the community's witness. They went to the church for mediation.
Wow.
It was also a democratizing force because inside those doors, your status wasn't determined by your wealth or your worldly success.
Which was the opposite of the outside world.
The complete opposite. Inside the church, your status was determined by your character and your standing in the faith. It gave people dignity. It provided order in a disorderly world. That is what a social stabilizer does.
And that's what Sarah feels she lost. She lost the place where the casserole matters more than the vote.
She lost the counterworld. The church used to be a place that offered an alternative to the cutthroat competition of the market and politics.
A refuge.
A refuge. But what Sarah witnessed is the collapse of that affectional community into a political monoculture. We are seeing a shift from a community defined by who we love to a community defined by who we fight.
Which brings up the concept of identity fusion. I know we have some data on this, but explain what that looks like psychologically.
So normally we have multiple identities, right? You are a podcaster, maybe you're a parent, a fan of a certain sports team, and you have your political views.
Right, different hats for different parts of your life.
Exactly. These are separate circles in your life. Identity fusion happens when those circles overlap so completely that they become indistinguishable.
They just merge into one big blob.
One blob. For a growing number of white evangelicals, the circle of Christian and the circle of Republican have essentially become one circle.
So it's not, I am a Christian who happens to vote Republican.
No.
It's, to be a Christian is to vote Republican.
Correct. And the inverse is also true. To vote Democrat is to be anti-Christian. The political identity has colonized the religious identity.
It's consumed it.
Yes. Yeah. If you go back to the era before 1970, the landscape was radically different.
I was shocked by these numbers.
Weren't you? White evangelical Democrats were common. In fact, they outnumbered white evangelical Republicans.
So it was a truly pluralistic community.
Absolutely. You could sit in a pew, disagree on tax policy, and still take communion together because the affectional bond, that casserole bond, was stronger than the political one. Today, the evangelical Democrat is statistically extinct. We're talking about numbers dropping to around 16% and falling. The sorting is complete.
So the entire group of people has just vanished or been pushed out.
Both. They've left, or their children have left, or they've changed their political affiliation to fit in. And when you have that kind of monoculture, the church stops being a place where you learn to love your neighbor who is different from you. It becomes a silo where you reinforce your shared grievances against the outside.
This connects back to that feeling of social anomie Sarah mentioned. Anomie is such a heavy word. It means a state of normlessness, of being adrift.
From the sociologist Emil Durkheim.
Right. If your anchor, the church, becomes just another part of the political storm, you're lost.
Right. And this leads to what some analysts call the video Rorschach test.
Fascinating.
It perfectly explains the woman you met in the lobby. When identity is fused, you lose a shared reality. You can show two people the same video clip, like the one on her phone.
Okay.
To you or to Sarah, that clip of the border might look like a humanitarian crisis, a logistical failure, or a tragedy involving families. You see human beings.
But to the woman in the lobby,
Because her faith and politics are fused, she sees an invasion. She sees an existential threat to her Christian nation.
The facts of the video are irrelevant. It's the interpretation that matters.
The interpretation is predetermined by the fused identity. Or, take January 6th, you see violence, an attack on an institution, the fused identity sees a patriot prayer meeting or a false flag operation.
There's no common ground to even begin a conversation.
The church, which should be the institution that grounds us in truth, the truth shall set you free, instead becomes a mechanism for reinforcing these alternative realities.
Oh.
That is the hollowed community. It provides political adrenaline, but it no longer provides the social stabilization. It's traded one for the other.
So the community structure has fundamentally changed. But communities don't just drift on their own, they are steered.
Yeah.
This brings us to the leadership, who is standing in the pulpit during this shift. I was watching a live stream of a sermon from a large congregation in the South, and it reminded me of a story I heard about a man named Pastor David. For 30 years, David was known for his quiet, scholarly approach to Scripture, a true religious meritocracy, where his authority came from his knowledge and his character.
The old model.
The old model, exactly. However, as the pews started to empty and the cultural influence of the church eroded, David felt a desperate need to stay relevant.
The panic sets in.
He began to adopt what sociologists call political narcissism. He stopped talking about the nuances of the New Testament and started branding himself as a warrior against secularism.
The language of battle.
Always. He discovered that when he spoke with aggression and certainty about political enemies, the likes on his videos skyrocketed and the donations poured in.
The algorithm rewards outrage.
It was a defensive response to his own fading authority. And seeing this as a professional observer of media trends, I can see why a leader would lean into this. It's a survival mechanism in an attention economy.
It's a rational choice in a way, a grimly rational one.
But there's a deep irony here. In trying to save his institution through political bravado, David ended up sacrificing the very theological integrity that made him a leader in the first place. It's a cautionary tale about how the ego, when threatened by a loss of status, often chooses the loudest path rather than the right one.
That story of Pastor David is a perfect microcosm of the leadership crisis. We are witnessing the collapse of religious meritocracy. In the old model, the one David started in, you earned authority through piety, through learning, through service. You visited the sick, you studied the Greek and Hebrew. That was your currency.
But that currency has been devalued.
It has crashed. In the attention economy, quiet piety doesn't get you noticed. Outrage gets you noticed.
So leaders like David switch currencies.
They start trading in political narcissism. And we need to dig into that term because it's not just about having a big ego. It's a specific relational dynamic.
You've mentioned the work of some psychologists on this. How does the narcissistic leader operate in this religious context?
Well, there's this profile of the ascetic saint. The leader presents himself not as a king initially, but as someone who is sacrificing everything for the cause.
Right, the I'm doing this for you posture.
I am taking the arrows for you. I am fighting the war so you can be safe. But in reality, he is feeding on a narcissistic supply of adulation.
It creates a feedback loop.
We call it the dyad. It's a dance between the leader and the led. The leader isn't just speaking into a void. He is acting out the repressed anger, the fears, and the fantasies of his followers.
So he says the things they are afraid to say at Thanksgiving dinner.
And in return, they give him total loyalty. It's a symbiotic relationship grounded in shared grievance.
And this relies on splitting.
Yeah.
That's the psychological term for it.
Yes. Splitting is a defense mechanism where the world is divided into all good and all evil. Nuance is the enemy. Complexity is weakness.
Everything is black and white.
Completely. In this worldview, we are the righteous remnant, and everyone else, the liberals, the secularists, even the other denominations, are demonic forces. If you are a leader whose authority is fading, like David, splitting is an incredibly powerful tool.
So?
It creates a permanent state of emergency. And if there is an emergency, you need a commander. You don't need a scholar or a gentle pastor.
You need a warrior.
You need a warrior.
It also involves projection. I see this constantly in the media I follow.
Constantly. The leader accuses the enemy of exactly what he is doing. If he is power hungry, he accuses the elites of being power hungry. If he is manipulating the truth, he accuses the media of fake news. It confuses the battlefield.
It muddies the water so you can't tell who's doing what.
Exactly. It's a classic authoritarian tactic.
Now, we focused on the evangelical side with Pastor David, but this power dynamic isn't unique to them. You brought up clericalism in the Catholic Church as a parallel.
Absolutely. Power protects power, regardless of the denomination. In the Catholic context, we talk about the kyriarchy, a system of domination based on the rule of the master or father.
So a top-down, unquestionable authority structure.
Yes, and it leads to the prince syndrome. You see bishops who insist on being addressed as your eminence, who live in palaces while their dioceses are crumbling.
I remember reading about bishops staying in five-star hotels while discussing abuse scandals.
Exactly. Or purchasing expensive oriental rugs while cutting soup kitchens.
It's the shift from service to entitlement.
And that entitlement explains the cover-ups. Why do they protect the institution over the victim of abuse? Because to the narcissistic leader, whether it's a bishop or a megachurch pastor, the institution is an extension of themselves. It is their mirror. To admit the institution is flawed is to admit they are flawed. And the narcissist cannot survive that injury, so they burn the victim to save the image.
This actually reminds me of the Berlin Psychoanalytic Insights looking at Germany between the wars. There's a historical parallel here about why people actually want this kind of leadership.
It's a crucial parallel. In the Weimar Republic, you had a society in deep anomie.
Yeah.
Exactly. The economy was wrecked, the culture was changing fast, gender roles were shifting, people felt the ground moving. And the Berlin analysts noted that in times of such deep anxiety, people don't want a suffering servant.
They don't want Jesus.
They don't want a Jesus who turns the other cheek. They want a strong man. They want absolute certainty, even if that certainty is a delusion.
So Pastor David becoming a warrior is actually a response to his congregation's terror. They are scared, so they hire a bodyguard instead of a shepherd.
The demand creates the supply. He's filling a market niche in the coldest possible terms.
But I want to push on this. Is it just psychology? Is it just that we have some insecure leaders and some scared followers? Or is there something more tangible, something structural, that is forcing this radicalization?
If this were just personality, it would be sporadic, it would be a few bad apples, but it's systemic.
So there's an engine.
There is an engine, and the engine driving it is demographic.
But first, I want to ground this in another story, because the numbers have real-world consequences for real towns. There's an account I read in a local news archive about an old deacon named Thomas in a dying mill town.
Okay.
His church was facing a demographic crisis. The young people had all moved to the cities, and the core social units of the town, the families, and the local industry had completely broken down.
The whole ecosystem was collapsing.
To keep the doors open, the church board decided to align themselves with a radical political movement that promised to bring back the old ways.
That desperate move.
Thomas watched as the church's budget for the local homeless ministry was diverted to fund political bus trips and activist workshops.
Wow, the mission just got swapped out.
Swapped out entirely. The institution survived, but it was no longer the church Thomas recognized. They had adopted a radical agenda not out of deep conviction, but as a desperate institutional survival tactic.
Survival at all costs.
And thinking about Thomas's story, it's easy to judge the church for its moral inconsistency, especially regarding issues like welfare and immigration, which seem at odds with their founding texts.
Yeah, the hypocrisy seems obvious from the outside.
Yet from a place of empathy, one can see the desperation of a group of people watching their world disappear. My concern, looking at this through a modern lens, is that when an institution decides that survival at any cost is the goal, it often pays for that survival with its own purpose, leaving behind a husk of political rhetoric where a heart of service used to be.
Deacon Thomas is witnessing demographic radicalization in real time. This is the why behind the what. It's based on the second demographic transition.
So what does that mean?
Well, in the modern world, having children is a choice, not an economic necessity. It's not about needing more hands for the farm anymore.
Right. It's a personal, often very costly decision.
Exactly. And it turns out there is a massive divide in who makes that choice. Secular, liberal, and moderate people choose to have fewer children. Religious fundamentalists choose to have more.
So it's a fertility gap.
It's a fertility-religiosity nexus.
Yeah.
Moderate religion simply doesn't reproduce itself, and I mean that literally in terms of birth rates and culturally in terms of retaining youth, as effectively as radical religion does.
So there's a filtering effect.
A huge filtering effect. The moderates breed out or they drift out. The radicals remain and multiply.
We see this in other countries too, right? This isn't just an American phenomenon.
No, Israel, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, have a birth rate that is vastly higher than the secular population.
A massive difference.
In a single generation, they have doubled their share of the population. This completely changes the political landscape. They go from being a fringe group to holding the balance of power.
And we are seeing that here in the U.S., a version of it.
The evangelical Democrat or the moderate Christian isn't just leaving, they are being demographically outpaced. The cohort that remains, the people left in Deacon Thomas's church, is smaller, yes, but it is significantly more intense, more conservative, and more radical.
This connects to the family structure itself. I've read some sociology on this, the link between family decline and religious decline.
Yes, some sociologists flip the conventional wisdom. We usually think people get religious and then have families.
Right.
But the argument is that the arrow goes the other way. The act of having a family drives people to church. You have kids, you realize you need help, you need community, you need moral structure. You go to church.
It creates the demand for what the church offers.
It does. So in Deacon Thomas's town, when the industry left, the families fell apart. The young people left to find work. The natural pipeline to the church, the family unit, broke.
Just dried up.
And this is the survival mechanism Thomas witnessed. If the church is no longer the natural community hub for flourishing families because those families don't exist there anymore, how do you get people in the door?
Right. What's your new value proposition?
What is it? You can't attract them with casserole dinners and youth soccer leagues if there are no kids and no money for casseroles.
So what do you replace the casserole with?
You replace it with high-voltage political identity. You attract them with shared grievance. You say, we are the last line of defense against the people who destroyed your town.
It becomes a fortress.
Yes, a fortress for the remnant. Thomas's church adopted a radical agenda because moderation leads to extinction in that demographic environment. Radicalism offers a pulse.
It offers a reason to exist.
It's existential panic masquerading as power.
It reframes the anger we see on the news. It's not just hate. It's a survival instinct kicked into overdrive. It's an institution gasping for air.
And that panic makes people vulnerable. It makes them willing to make deals they wouldn't have made 20 years ago. It opens the door to the Faustian bargain.
So we've looked at the hollowed out community, the narcissistic leadership, and this demographic pressure cooker. But I still want to understand the individual process.
Okay.
How does the nice woman in the lobby, or someone like her, a decent person, get to the point where she's accepting things she would have flatly rejected 20 years ago?
This is where we have to look at the mechanics of complicity. It doesn't happen overnight.
It never does.
It's the classic frog in the kettle analogy. Some analysts call this sequential complicity. You are warmed up to the radicalism degree by degree.
Let's trace that temperature rising. Because I think most people have a wrong assumption about where the heat started. We tend to think this started in 2016, or maybe with the culture wars of the 90s.
That's the common view. But the water started heating up much earlier. A lot of people assume the religious riots started with Roe v. Wade in the 70s.
That's the standard narrative. Christians mobilized to stop abortion.
It is. But the historical record tells a more uncomfortable story.
What's the real story?
The real galvanizing issue for the religious right in the 1970s wasn't abortion. It was the IRS challenging the tax-exempt status of segregation academies.
Wow.
Private Christian schools, like Bob Jones University, that excluded or discriminated against Black students.
So the initial political mobilization was about protecting segregation.
It was about protecting their institutions from government interference regarding segregation. That was the spark. But they realized pretty quickly that defending segregation was a losing political strategy nationally.
It's not a good look.
So over time, the focus shifted to abortion and family values. But the kettle was set on the stove of racial grievance and anti-government sentiment. That was the foundational heat.
Then what happens in the 80s?
You get the Reagan rehearsal. This was a crucial step in the bargain. Remember, Reagan was a divorced Hollywood actor.
He wasn't exactly the model of evangelical piety.
Not even close. But he went to them and essentially made a transaction.
I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you.
Character was traded for political utility. We will overlook your personal life if you give us the policy wins. This set the psychological precedent.
It taught the movement that the ends justify the mean.
And then inside the church, you had the purge.
The takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yes, in the 80s and 90s, this was the internal kettle. The moderates were systematically removed. The seminaries were cleaned house. Professors who weren't towing the new fundamentalist line were fired.
So it taught the movement how to exile dissenters.
It created that monoculture we spoke about earlier. It was a hostile takeover from the inside.
So by the time 2016 rolls around, the muscle memory is already there. They know how to purge dissenters, and they know how to trade character for power.
Exactly. The frog is already warm, but then the sheet gets turned up to boiling. And we can measure the effect of this sequential complicity with hard data.
This is the spin cycle. This is the data point that absolutely blew my mind when I saw it. The shift in how evangelicals view morality and leadership.
In 2011, PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, asked white evangelicals if an elected official who commits an immoral act in their private life can still perform their public duties ethically.
Okay, no is the answer.
Only 30% said yes. They were the group most likely to say character matters. Character counts was the slogan in the 90s.
I remember that very clearly. Look at 2016, the same question is asked.
Yeah.
This time, 72% of white evangelicals said yes, private immorality is compatible with public leadership.
72%?
That is a 42-point shift in just 5 years.
That's not a drift, that's a complete U-turn on the highway.
It's whiplash.
It's ethical flexibility on a massive scale.
Yeah.
To maintain the political bargain, they had to rewrite their own moral code. They had to decide that gaining political power and Supreme Court seats justified supporting a leader who violated their traditional values.
That is the bargain, laid bare in the data. And what happens if you don't go along with the rewrite? If you stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, didn't we say character mattered?
Then you pay the price of dissent. We've seen this with figures like Russell Moore, Beth Moore, David French, absolute pillars. But when they questioned the political fusion, they weren't just treated as having a different political opinion. They were treated as heretics, as traitors.
Because the identity is fused. Attacking the politics is attacking the faith.
Correct. And the language reflects that. We see the militarization of faith. It's no longer about dialogue or witness. It's spiritual warfare.
I remember reading about Campus Crusade for Christ using military terminology way back in the day.
Terms like blitz, enlist, crusade, that martial language has always been there, but now it has been weaponized against domestic political opponents.
So it's been turned inward.
Yes. When you frame your political opponent not just as wrong, but as demonic, you have removed the possibility of democracy.
You can't compromise with a demon.
You can only destroy them.
That brings us back to the woman in the lobby with the video clip. She isn't looking at policy. She's looking at a battle between good and evil. And she has been trained step by step, decade by decade, to see it that way.
She didn't wake up one morning deciding to be radicalized. She was boiled in the kettle. She was led there by leaders who needed her fear to maintain their power, and by a demographic reality that made her feel like her world was ending.
So let's just unpack where we've been. We've traced a path from the quiet casserole-carrying community of the past, the social stabilizer, to a polarized, demographically shrinking, but politically militant fortress of the present.
A huge journey.
And we've seen how insecure leadership and these narcissistic dynamics fueled this, and how the loss of families drove churches into a kind of survivalist panic.
And we've seen the mechanism of complicity, how sequential steps allow decent people to rationalize things they never thought they would.
It revisits that woman in the lobby. Her shift, that hardening of her heart, wasn't an accident, it wasn't a fluke. It was the result of decades of sequential complicity, demographic pressure, and the leadership structure that prioritized power over integrity.
And this is where the hypocrisy that outsiders talk about comes from. It's the most common critique leveled at the movement. People outside the church look at the Sermon on the Mount, welcome the stranger, feed the poor, turn the other cheek, and then they look at the political platform of the loudest Christian voices. Strict borders, cutting aid, aggression.
The gap is enormous.
They call it hypocrisy. But to the insider, it doesn't feel like hypocrisy. It feels like survival.
It feels like defense. Like they're protecting the last bastion of goodness in a wicked world.
Exactly. But the cost is the Faustian bargain coming due. The knowns, the people leaving the church, like Sarah, aren't leaving because they hate God.
No.
They are leaving because they see a movement that demands their identity fusion rather than their soul. They see a movement that asks for their vote but ignores their questions.
It's a heavy realization. The tragedy of Deacon Thomas and Sarah is that they lost their home, not to a fire or a flood, but to a slow, methodical redefinition of what it means to belong. The church survived the changing times, but in the process, it became something its own founders might struggle to recognize.
Yeah.
We are left looking at a movement that gained the world of political influence, but we have to wonder about the price paid in the currency of its own soul.